Would you mind if I still did a summary on this one then?
Yeah, I'm all right with that. Yeah, because we had a small class, I normally try to get a different student to lead each discussion on each book, but we came up a few short, even with me offering extra credit and such. So I think we've got one more student discussion left for book 13. Hey, come on in, join the fun.
Everyone getting the vaccine or something?
It's a beautiful Friday in spring at a point where people are exhausted. I think I can figure out what's going on. Attendance was also low in my logic courses, which I always kind of groan internally because, if you're missing class at this point in the semester, you better have everything up to this point last year, because if you're hurting, you're going to get destroyed in the last 2 weeks. And that's often what happens is on the final, a certain substantial minority leave. It's one of the reasons I give a comprehensive final rather than a final that just focuses on the last section of logic is some people leave the sections completely blank from the last 2 weeks. So
what is the last section again?
Proofs. Proofs and refutation. So, basically doing cool stuff with all the propositional logic we learned. So if I gave an exam that focused exclusively on that content rather than a comprehensive, those students would get zeros or close to zeros. And since I already give out more low grades in that course than any other, I prefer not to do that. All right, so reminder, peer review was due today. If I only opened up the link, the spot for a few minutes ago, so if you haven't submitted yet, no big deal. If for some reason you haven't obtained somebody's paper to write comments on, let me know and I will get one to you. Maybe we'll give a second set of comments to somebody. Or in a worst case scenario, I'll just find a paper from the last time I ran the Augustine course, and for someone who's not in the class, and to write comments on that, because it is a best practice and a disciplinary skill to learn to evaluate other people's thoughts in a constructive way, and I do find that people improve their own thinking as they engage other people's thinking in this way. How did peer review go? So John, did you not get a paper yet, or is that?
I did. Well, so I emailed Eric like a little bit before class, asking him to just send me something to edit and Max.
That's fine. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Grant, how did yours go?
They won't lie, I edited Max's paper, but he edited mine and really roasted me.
Well, it is good to see how someone might roast you or might think you were roastable. It is good to respond to all such comments, although sometimes the response can look something like this. Sometimes you can add in a footnote something like this. Someone might mistakenly think this view is incorrect for such and such a reason, the reason you get given when they roasted you. But this would be mistaken because of this and that and the other thing, and therefore therefore yay me, boo you. So I mean, it's because there's always objections, and it's good to learn how to engage objections, and even good thinkers sometimes make bad objections, and even good thinkers are sometimes vulnerable to objections, and it's good to, sort of distinguish between the two. But yeah, in general, you should do something in response to somebody's comment, even if the comment is stupid. And not having not read his comments, I have no idea whether or not they're stupid. And sometimes the most revealing thing is, oh, they misinterpreted me. Is that my fault? Because sometimes there's a bad comment, but the bad comment reveals that I expressed myself poorly, and I need to express myself in a way that does not lead to this particular misinterpretation, which they thought made me vulnerable to a certain roast-worthy style comment.
Well, here's a good question. He didn't really roast me. It was just like, I guess when I edit papers, I'm like very like, oh, this is really good, but he was very much like, change this, or like, here's what you could change. But I think he was getting to the same point that I would have.
Yeah, all right, good.
A good question maybe I have is, while writing this paper, I guess we're writing it for your class,
right?
And then possibly other things.
Sure.
Should we write with what should we, for the audience? Is it like they know most things, or like, for example, I had to explain. He said I should explain Pelagianism better.
Yeah.
And that's not really common knowledge, I guess, even for like a theology kind of person.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you need to describe Pelagianism better? I'd say that you probably need to do a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of Pelagianism.
Okay.
I wouldn't make it a big thing because it's not at the center of your paper. But if you're going to reference it at all, you need to give enough to go on. Because that's one of those things, if you work in theology, you should know what Pelagianism is. But it's far enough from the issues the average Joe is preoccupied with that I wouldn't quite think it was condemnable for like an upper level undergrad to not know what that is. And that's kind of who your audience should be, right, for somebody who has the knowledge discussed in this class.
Okay.
So you don't want to like explain who Augustine is. Anyone reading your paper should know who Augustine was. But you don't want to presuppose nuanced knowledge of stuff like that. So I'd give like a 1-sentence description of Pelagianism, maybe like right out of a theology dictionary or something.
Okay.
But I wouldn't make it a big deal. I wouldn't take a whole paragraph. It's always hard to know for stuff like that. So when in doubt, giving yourself providing a little more detail is never bad.
All right. When is the final due again? Is that the end of the year?
I've been saying that the final exam was due the last day of class, which is in a week and a half. And then we've got our final exam period, where we are required by the administration to have an official meeting. So what we do is we come and we each do like a 5-minute discussion of our paper. It's not like a heavily formal presentation, but it's a casual discussion. And then maybe if I haven't checked the schedule, maybe we'll go out for like Panera or something afterwards if you guys want. All right, let's look at book 12, form and matter. 2 of the traditional Greek concepts that are at sort of the foundation of the Western metaphysical tradition, both secular and religious, is the form and matter distinction. This goes back to, it's mentioned in Aristotle, it's in Plato. It wouldn't shock me if it precedes Plato. My systematic knowledge of the Western tradition doesn't really go further than Plato. So, but I bet it goes back even a little bit before Plato. And the idea is something like this. Matter is the physical stuff reality is made out of. But matter always has to come with a form, something that gives it shape, gives it purpose, gives it identity. In Aristotle, there are 4 causes of any physical substance, and 2 of them are the formal cause, which is a reference to form, and another is the material cause, which is, of course, a reference to matter. If we were to send this all the way back to Plato, again, we would reference the divided line. And form is from the realm of the immaterial, and matter is, of course, in the realm of the physical and material. And there are sort of free-floating immaterial forms, but any material object or substance has to have a relationship to its formal causes. So if material is shaped in a triangular way, it has a relationship with the form of triangularity. If something is beautiful, if a physical thing is beautiful, it has a relationship with the form of beauty. If a material thing is tall, it has a relationship with the form of tallness, and so forth. So for Plato, material things always participate in, have a relationship with, immaterial things. For Aristotle, material things are always directly shaped by immaterial forms that are sort of actively within them, shaping them. And they're both discussed in terms of causation, along with what we normally think of as cause and effect. So for Augustine, he is going to discuss form and matter of the universe in terms of this traditional Greek concept. So one appropriate question is, are these even the right kind of concepts to use? Are we reading Greek concepts into a Hebrew text? Is it a kind of anachronism? One of the important relevant scriptures, or perhaps the most important relevant scripture, why isn't this on? There we go. Let's get us at some Genesis chapter 1. NIV, King James. Let's go ESV today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form, or most translations, formless and void. The darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So the significance of this formlessness and void, this is important to our discussion and Augustine's discussion. And he wants to discuss God shaping the activity of not only God creating the primordial matter, but also actively having a turn in shaping it. There is some ambiguity of interpretation here, whether these things were, at what point does time itself start to exist? So all of this is creation ex nihilo. God creates, so, the first verse, God, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. But then subsequently, God gives shape and form to the formless and void earth. And that is what Augustine is going to focus on in his commentary on Book 12, where, frankly, he becomes very preoccupied with synchronizing Genesis with Platinian metaphysics and Platinian views of the emanations of creation and such. Now, interestingly, this verse and the proper interpretation of these two verses becomes very important for some contemporary debates in religion. So one common religious theory is that the initial creation of the earth happens millions of years, that there's like there's millions of years gap between verses 2 and 3. So this enables some interpreters of Genesis to say, yeah, if carbon dating says the earth is 80 million or billion years old, well, that's consistent with scripture, because it says in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, but only later does do the days of creation happen. So the days of creation are sort of a days of recreation or something like that. I'm not particularly interested in those debates, but I do think that maybe you are, or maybe, when we're talking about how to interpret Genesis, more recent. Nobody's trying to make Genesis cohere with Platinian philosophy anymore. They're more interested in have it cohere with carbon dating or Darwin or something like that. I also note that the first chapter or two of Genesis have sort of a semi-poetic language, which definitely encourages a kind of metaphorical interpretation of a lot of what's going on. All right. Let's see what else we got. It's just 3 of us. All right, the two heavens in chapter 2 of Book 12. The lowliness of my tongue confesses to your highness that you have made the heaven and the earth. The heaven which I see is earth, on which I tread, and from which comes this earth. I bear about myself. You have made them, but where is that heaven of heavens? There is a distinction between the corporeal sky, that which physically is beyond the corporeal sky, and that which is the spiritual realm where God exists in many of the ancient, when people like Augustine are trying to figure out the distinction between heaven and earth and the sky. I mean, these are the discussions that they're having. This is why it's incorrect to describe Yahweh as a sky deity, because most of the conversation, I mean, yeah, there's probably some people that thought he was literally in the sky, but generally, smarter, more robust theologians like Augustine are going to say, no, that's just a metaphor, you moron. Or, I mean, even he would say that to himself. Yeah, I used to think like that too when I was a stupid Manichaean and, wasn't really trying to understand the scripture. Of course, it's like looking for the gods literally on Mount Olympus. I mean, come on. We're not like Greek pagans here. We're theologians. We're Platonists. We know better. All right, so chapter 3, assuredly this earth was invisible and without order, and there was, I know not, what profound abyss upon which there was no light, because there was no form in it. Whence you commanded it to be written that darkness was upon the deep. What else was this but the absence of light? Good Platonic thinking. Darkness is a privation of light. If there were light, where else would it be except up above, standing visible and shedding its rays? Therefore, where there was yet no light, what was the presence of darkness except the absence of light? So darkness was upon it because there was no light upon it, just as there is no sound. When there is no sound, there is silence. What does it mean that silence is in a place except that sound is not there? Lord, have you not taught this soul which confesses to you? Lord, have you not taught me that before you formed this unformed matter, and fashioned it into kinds, there was no separate being, no color, no shape, no body, no spirit. Yet there was not absolutely nothing. There was a certain formlessness devoid of any specific character. So according to Augustine, in verse 1 and 2, God creates unformed matter. The initial creation is unformed matter. The days of creation are the adding of form to the already created unformed matter. So, so verses 1 and 2, properly speaking, are creation ex nihilo. The rest of Genesis are, verses 1 and 2 is creation ex nihilo. The rest of Genesis chapter 1 is working with the already made unformed matter. What then should be called, if not by some familiar word, so that it may be instilled in some way into even more to our sluggish minds? So, I mean, this is where he basically says it's prime matter or unformed matter. That seems to be what he's dancing around here, which is a Platonian concept. Chapter 5, the problem of matter. Hence, when thought seeks what mind may attain to in it, says itself, it is not an intelligible form like life or like justice, but it is the matter of bodies. Here you can see Platonic thinking. Intelligible forms are immaterial things, life and justice. Physical things are material things, bodies. Nor is it a sensible form, because what may be seen and what may be sensed is not found in what is invisible and unordered. All right. Let's press forward. The highest heaven, chapter 9. Therefore, when the Spirit, the teacher of your servant, recounts that in the beginning you made heaven and earth, he says nothing of times and is silent of days. Doubtlessly, that heaven of heavens, which you made in the beginning, is some kind of intellectual creature. Although in no manner co-eternal with you, the Trinity, it is yet a partaker of your eternity, and because of its most sweet and happy contemplation of you, it firmly checks its own mutability. So Augustine stipulates that where does God and the angels currently exist? Well, there is a kind of intellectual realm where angels, which are rational intellectual beings, exist. But even that realm is created by God prior to the creation of this material world.
I have a question.
Sure.
this is kind of a big question maybe, and I don't know how much it relates, but I'm writing a paper right now in my honors class where we read the Republic, and I didn't feel like writing anything on the Republic really, so I'm writing about how the like modern Christian view of heaven is inherently platonic, like the way that just the lay Christian or whatever would see it. So I guess one thing I'm struggling with is obviously Plato didn't believe in a heaven, but like I brought in Phaedo and how he believes in the immortality of the soul.
Right.
But I guess how does this so he's describing a spiritual realm that God exists now, and the angels, but then he's not making a case for like heaven necessarily because Augustine I guess holds like the paradise thing where you go to sleep.
I don't think he believes in soul sleep.
Okay.
But that's because upon death you leave the current temporal realm. So you immediately enter into like a neo-eternal state.
Okay.
Not truly eternal, because you will not grasp all of eternity at once, but not so sort of co-temporal with this realm. Which is why on something like most medievals view, it would make sense to say everyone arrives at heaven at the same time, no matter when they die.
Okay.
So yeah, your observation is absolutely correct. Here, let me share something I'm a little embarrassed by. I thought of heaven in a platonic way. I mean, probably till I was about 30. Where I just thought, heaven were all these sort of spirits, these sort of, souls. And it wasn't until I was, in grad school reading philosophy when I realized, 1 Corinthians 15, it's a physical resurrection. Oh my God, how did I miss that? So then you ask, well, where do we get that other view? Yeah, you get that other view from Plato. And if you look at the Republic Book 10, where he gives the myth of that's where people get that's the source, that's at least a major source material for why people would think the afterlife is sort of floating around. Now, the medievals end up having a real problem with the physicality of heaven, ironically. Generally, the majority medieval view is what we do in heaven with our bodies is we sit around meditating on the reality of contemplating God's essence face to face. So, despite the fact that heaven is physical and material to the medievals, it turns out to not be a very important part of heaven. The body, the eternal body turns out to be mostly a physical casing for the contemplative, rational soul, which then makes you say, well, gee, why bother? But in the Hebrew tradition, in the Hebrew scriptural tradition, you do have a lot of heavenly paradise imagery looking very much like idealized earthly life. The lion lays down with the lamb, there are rivers flowing, there's green trees and fruit and relationships. And that thread is taken a little bit farther, I think, in Revelation, where the eternal city is a physical city of gold and bejeweled and have gates and a temple and a wedding feast. And all of these are much more physical metaphors than what the medievals really camp out on. So one way to criticize the medievals is to say they really have too much play. Why would you think that the only role of the physical body is to house the rational mind as it meditates on God? Well, one reason is because you still are sort of implicitly a Platonist, and you don't really have much room for, bodily existence in paradise. Have you looked up my book, Paradise Understood?
No, I haven't.
Are you aware of my book, Paradise
I'm not.
Understood? Okay.
That'd be really helpful.
I have edited a book called Paradise Understood, New Philosophical Essays About Heaven, where I have written, I only wrote one, but I've got like a dozen contributors on what heaven might be like, philosophically speaking. I don't think anyone goes after, ironically, now, upon reflection, maybe I should have had somebody go after the what about Plato issue. But I think if you look at the essays there, you'll see a nice contrast to that Neoplatonic Christian, the afterlife is about sitting around meditating on the material things kind of view.
Okay, that's super helpful actually. I don't have any sources.
There you go. And the nice thing about that, once you get that source, I encourage you to steal our bibliography and track down other sources.
Okay.
So once you find one good source, you can use it to hunt down other good sources. Who are you doing that paper for?
Brent Kusher, he's in the leadership department, but he's a big ancient philosophy guy.
Cool.
So it doesn't really interact with the class at all, but he was like, do something that you're interested in, don't write. Because he's big on political philosophy, which
Sure.
I was gonna actually do City of God, but then I was like, I can't read this before I have to write this paper.
Speaking as a guy that likes Augustine, that book's just a bear.
Yeah. So this is what I ended up on.
So yeah, so that should be helpful. No, that's good. It's good to know. All right, back to Confessions, Book 12. If you look at chapter 15, there are some objections that Augustine wants to address. And I think what he wants to address is, I think his detractors here, he pictures kind of I don't want to use the word fundamentalist because that would be an anachronism. Because fundamentalists didn't truly exist until the Declaration of the Fundamentals in the first half of the 20th century. But what he sees as his enemy is kind of a straightforward wooden reading of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and a straightforward idea that Moses, who he believes wrote Genesis, the full interpretation, the full meaning of the scriptures has to be exactly what Moses was thinking when he would have written it or dictated it. So Augustine is going to argue that it is dangerous to think of interpreting scripture in terms of a single monofaceted interpretation. This can be mistaken for sort of a relativistic view, which he is not suggesting. He's not suggesting that true interpretations can contradict each other in scripture. But what he seems to have in mind is something like this. This perfect sphere, sarcasm noted, this perfect sphere includes the full, true, accurate interpretation of a scripture like Genesis 1. And within that one full, true, accurate interpretation, there can be a lot of stuff that doesn't sound exactly like one another. There can be a historical component. There can be a symbolic component. There can be a metaphorical component. There can be a prophetic component. And even within each of these, there can be multiple true things that do not sound exactly like one another. So, for example, an Old Testament metaphor might be symbolic of, say, two things. So if my sermon talks about one of the symbolisms of Genesis, there might be a second equally true sermon with an equally true interpretation that focuses on the second one. So all this to say, there is only one full, true, accurate interpretation of the scriptures. But Augustine wants to contradict and oppose the sort of simplistic wooden interpretation of Genesis to say that this is all that Genesis means, exactly what we say. And Augustine wants us to say basically, maybe that is true and is within the one true interpretation, but that does not exhaust the truth of the symbols and metaphors that are current in this passage. So hopefully that makes Augustine sound deep and rich and not like some sort of flimsy milk toast that says Augustine that Genesis can mean whatever it wants. It does not mean that. Let's see. The city of God. We want that. Okay, so look at chapter 17. Although these words are true, yet Moses was not considering the two things you named, when by the revelation of the Spirit he said, in the beginning God made heavens and the earth. By the term heaven, he did not mean that spiritual intellectual creature which contemplates God's face, or by the term earth did he mean formless matter. So this is, again, this is what the kind of viewpoint that Augustine is engaging, the sort of limited perspectival viewpoint that says there can be only one sort of wooden facet to the truth of Scripture, and that there is nothing further that can be true metaphorically or symbolically. Because it is correct in chapter 17 that Moses does not appear to have these Greek categories in mind. I mean, it's almost certain. Chapter 18, ways to interpret Scripture. Having heard and considered all these problems, I do not wish to pretend in words, for it is to no profit, but speaks subversion of the hearers. But the law is good to edify if a man uses it lawfully, for the end of it is charity, from a pure heart with good conscience and unfeigned faith, quoting St. Paul, I believe. Our Master has known upon which two commands he would make the whole law and the prophets depend. What harm comes to me, O my God, light my eyes in secret, if I zealously confess these things to you? What harm comes to me if various meanings may be found in these words, all of which are true? What harm comes to me, I say, if I think differently than another thinks, as to what he who wrote these words thought? All of us who read strive to trace out and understand what he whom we read actually meant. Since we believe him to speak the truth, we dare not assert that he spoke anything we know or think to be false. Therefore, while every man tries to understand the Holy Scriptures, what the author understood therein, what wrong is there if anyone understands what you, O light of all truthful minds, revealed to him as true, even if the author he reads did not understand this, since he also understood the truth, though not this truth. Here, let me offer a different passage of Scripture that might show this principle at work. All right, so here's one. This is a famous messianic prophecy from Isaiah 7. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol, hell, or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you will weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. But before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's houses such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. All right, so what's going on here? Well, it looks, let me try to remember my context here. Ahaz is the current king of the southern kingdom of Israel, and he's speaking with Isaiah, a prophet of God, and most likely, I forget which kingdom they were being attacked by, either Babylon or almost certainly Babylon, though it might have been Assyria, the Syrian Empire, but I think it was Babylon. So what sign will there be that they will survive, that things will go well for the kingdom? Well, there's this famous line about a virgin conceiving and bearing a son, and his name being Emmanuel, God with us, and how old he'll be when these things will come to pass. Some commentators say, well, wait a minute. This passage gets cited in the New Testament. That's bogus. It's clearly about something in Isaiah's day. Some young woman in court who is not yet married. You could imagine Isaiah even pointing her out. That woman, who's not yet married, maybe she's 12 or something, or 14. Watch her. She will have a son. The name will have these sort of spiritual significance. And by the time her son is mature, those kingdoms you worry about will be desolated. So wait a second. So does the historic interpretation of Isaiah conflict with a future prophetic interpretation? Now, on Augustine's account, no, they don't. For Augustine, one can completely admit, yes, Isaiah, to the people listening to him in that day, Ahaz, for example, there was a literal, what would have this been, 6th, 7th century BC interpretation and fulfillment of those words. And yet at the same time, this passage can also be a future-oriented prophecy of Christ, and the one does not disclude the other. So this is good Augustinian thinking. All right, so we get to what else do we read? Oh, all right, skipping ahead quite a bit. If you go to chapter 29, there is a discussion on the relationship between sort of in what sense is God first, and in what sense is the primordial creation prior to the forming of creation in verses 3 and on of chapter 1. And Augustine's main emphasis is sort of a logical priority, because there can't be temporal priority prior to the creation of the world, because there's no time in existence. So there's kind of a logical priority rather than a temporal priority. Those are the main points I thought worthy of thinking. Thoughts, questions? See, normally I count on you guys to provide some good material for discussion, but we have a small audience today, and apparently not everyone did the proper reading. John, how's your end of semester shaping up?
It's going all right. I've got another couple papers I'm working on as well for a couple of philosophy classes.
Good.
I have one for Dr. Jelinek that she recommended I use for my senior seminar paper.
Oh, good.
semester. And then some writing about the existence of numbers.
Yes, there are some very interesting philosophical implications that one might argue for from the existence of numbers. That's interesting. What's your paper argue about?
I argue that they are not abstract objects themselves, but they are descriptions of abstract objects.
Oh, well, that's a very interesting nuanced position. Cool. Do you discuss the implications that has for alternative numerical systems other than our current base 10 system? So does that work well with the possibility that our main mathematical schemata could have been binary instead of base 10?
I kind of talk about like I compare them to like the forms a little bit and like how like the way we use numbers and like how we think about numbers could have been completely different. Like it could be different, completely different for a different society than ours. They could have different.
I mean,
But like numbers are still numbers. So,
interesting.
like we're basically still.
Well, I really encourage you, you're familiar with binary, right? Think about the implications your thesis has for things like binary. And I think I'm giving you good grist for your ability, right? Your theory works well with that the values expressed in binary are the thing we're getting at, but the symbols, base 10 versus binary, then they could surely be different. And as we know, Arabic numbers are just the only numerical system out there. We can use Roman numerals. So something to think about. I 2 cents. But cool. Well, if Jelinek thinks your paper is good, that your paper is, shaping up nicely. She's not she's not somebody who says that about just any paper. She's very thoughtful. Well, in that case, I suppose we can be done.
I'm looking at the chapters or the essays in your book. They look really interesting. There's the one on in defense of animal universalism, which is so interesting to me.
Yeah. I'll be 100% honest here. Let me turn off the video before I say this. Here,